When a utility approaches leveraging the cloud, they tend to have a number of concerns around that. I'm going to talk about three that address things that go above and beyond security. Security is a completely separate topic and it needs its own dedicated time. I'm going to give you an overview of this and know that there are a lot of details behind each one of them. And in the interest of time, I want to make sure I cover these at a high level. So the three concerns that I'm going to cover today are what can be capitalized. And spoiler alert, there are a lot of things that can be capitalized. How do I educate people? So how do I take people that exist in my organization and upskill them? And then can I lower costs? So let's talk about capitalization, because this tends to be the number one barrier for utilities adopting the cloud. Often the capital accounting team says if it smacks of something you're renting or it can't be capitalized. Well, each capital accounting team has its own set of rules, but there tends to be three dimensions to those rules at a whole. And each utility will have their own capital accounting team that has their own level of risk they're willing to take on and own ways to apply these rules. So please work with your capital accounting team to make sure you understand and you partner with them on this. I'm going to give you the experience that I had when I figured this out for my former employer. So there are three dimensions that tend to play in are the investment threshold. And often utilities say that it's $1 million. Some utilities have worked and made filings to lower that to $500,000. Again, work with your capital accounting team to determine what that is. Another one is useful life of the asset that you build. And that tends to be 5 years or more. That can be capitalized. And then lastly is that asset that is built, can I take possession of it? Is it something that I own? And a test for us in the cloud COE was, can I move that asset, that code, from one cloud provider to another cloud provider? And depending on how you structure this, the answer to that is absolutely yes. Now, I'm going to talk through just a very high level. What we did within the cloud COE is we built the cloud COE ended up building products. And these products as a whole would last longer than 5 years, would take more than $1 million to build, and could be moved in concept from one cloud provider to another. And a high level, I'll give you some of the products that we built. One of them was the landing zone itself. And think of that as your central set of controls, your connectivity to your on-prem data centers, the vending of accounts. So in our case with AWS, we were able to say, all right, workload here is your own AWS account for production and your own AWS account for development. And that made it really easy for those teams to get started and going. Databases as a product. So think about, you've got your relational databases like Oracle and MySQL and MS SQL, etc. And then you have your NoSQL databases like DocumentDB and DynamoDB, etc. And you can create variations of those. So if you have a whole team that is dedicated to making sure they certify the database, they make sure all the controls are in place, they work with the teams to evolve, continue the development of, etc. That's a product. And databases exist on all the cloud providers. So that makes it portable. Next are compute and storage as a product. Think of this as your EC2 image that has all your standard, any agents that you need on there, any security controls you need in place, etc. Each of the projects that create a server from that image, right? They immediately get all of that, and they, from the very beginning. And then there's the corresponding storage options. So you've got your block storage, like EBS, which is attaching to your server, or your EFS storage, which is shared amongst compute, and then your your object storage like S3, and all the standards around that. So there's a product that is developed there. Then there's the pipeline, and the pipeline is used when you have source code, you check something in, it does a build, it does a test deploy, makes it available for testing, and then eventually can get released out into production. And so that's very powerful. And your CI/CD pipeline can be a combination, or it can be a combination of centralized pipelines that everybody uses. And then you can also instantiate individual pipelines for a particular workload if that workload has need of some specialized features. And then lastly, something like federated identity, which is a product that applications can use to bake in authentication using your identity provider. Now, the concept here is I have a team, the Cloud COE is building these products, okay? And these products are based on code, okay? I write code that defines these. I check it into my source code provider, and then I make it available through some kind of catalog for projects to use. And so if I'm a project and I'm coming along and I say I'm gonna run in the cloud, I now have this catalog of products I can use to build my project, right? So give me an AWS account for development, give me a database on that account, give me some compute that goes against it, give me a pipeline that I can deploy into that, right? And so all of these products can and usually will meet the capitalization threshold. So all of the effort that goes into building this and all the people time, etc., is capitalizable. Now, one of the things that was pretty much a non-starter with my capital accounting team was, look, all that build is great, but as soon as I get a invoice from the cloud provider, from AWS, that can't be capitalized, okay? Even reserved instances were not something that was capitalizable at that time. And instead of fighting that, I said, that's fine, because that actually makes sense, because that is, the thing has been built and it's now running, right? It's now used and useful. That should be a bill that I get and should be expense. That is an incentive to make sure what you build is optimized, right? And so you've got lots of tools that make sure that you're only running what you need at the right size. You're using things like auto scaling to keep costs low, etc. Spot instances. There's lots of tools out there that help you keep your costs down. So that's capitalization. That is building the cloud platform. And the idea here is there's a decision tree that you can build based on your rules that says what can be capitalized and what can't. And that is something that I can include in a future talk. So the good news is there's a lot that can be capitalized. This is something that is very powerful, and those products evolve. And there's more than just these products, by the way. There's functions. There's a whole bunch of things you get to define as a product in the Cloud COE. And it's not static, right? You can't, at the beginning you've set 5 products and there's no more going to be there. That's not the case. You can always add, subtract, you can deprecate, and there's life cycle stages for each of the products that I'll cover in another discussion. So the next question is, how do I educate people? This is a big one, and this is probably one of the biggest components of success when it comes to cloud, because what you're trying to do here is change the culture. And you need a certain number of people operating in the new way to create that tipping point moment. And it's, according to Malcolm Gladwell and some of the research he and his team did, it's about 10%. It's not as high as you would think. You get about 10% of people operating in the new way, and things start to accelerate. So one of the big programs that I set up was the Cloud Mentorship Program. Now, I was a mentor, but I was more of a mentor for executives rather than for the individual contributors. I took people from the Cloud COE, and they became mentors for people all across the company. We did not just limit this to IT, okay? Because you want the business able to talk in that same way. And there's a whole bunch of very, very enthusiastic people in the business that recognize the value of cloud. And so they're wanting to go along that process as well. And it's structured. So it tends to be, all right, you're going to get a Cloud Guru account. I'll get specific, or some kind of educational account that you hold a license for, and you give that to that person. You meet with them on a frequent enough basis that you're staying connected with that person, and not so frequent that it's a burden. Okay. So what I tended to do was 15 to 20 minutes once a month, and tracking to some kind of certification. If there is a desire to meet more frequently, that's up to the mentor. Okay. And there it is. And then it's open, like I said, it's open to everyone. And then you track certification. So in the AWS land, there's Cloud Practitioner, which is kind of the minimum viable non-engineer certification. So if you're in management or you're in a support role to this, getting that allows you to talk about the cloud in a common way. Then the one that I consider the minimum viable mindset shift for engineers is the Solution Architect Associate. That is the meatiest certification that will help people go from, this is how I used to do it, to, there's this new way of doing it. That was my personal experience. And then there's, of course, all the way through the professional and the specialty certifications. And you have a tracker and some kind of dashboard, and you celebrate. Anytime somebody gets a certification, it's a big celebration. And you can do a big celebration once a month, or if you've got some kind of end of sprint ceremony that you're doing, if you're using sprints to do this work, you can have all your leadership there and make a big deal out of it. We had stickers that got handed out. We also had flavors of certification. So if you had all associate certifications, the 3 associate AWS certifications, you got some kind of special recognition. As soon as you got a professional level certification, you got another set of recognition that's above and beyond just the fact that you got professional certification. And then if you had all 5, that again was another thing to be celebrated. So there's lots of ways you can set this mentorship program up to work. The other element to this is you make it easy, but not without some level of friction, to get an AWS account. And let me qualify some amount of friction, right? You want to make it so that the people that are going through this process get access to the tools they need to learn. Now, most of the certification processes you can do with a free tier account, so you can do it on your own personal thing and you can figure this out. Well, wouldn't it be nice if the company picked up the tab for any costs that were incurred, and you use your corporate credentials to log in, and you get an experience that kind of matches what it's going to be like when you exit the certification. So what we did was created a learning and innovation area within our AWS organizations. It was less restricted. Okay, so in your production and your lower environments, we had lots of restrictions because those accounts would connect into our data center. So you did not want to have freedom there, too much freedom there. You wanted to have a lot of controls. But over here, these accounts for learning and innovation, they will never connect into the corporate account, into the corporate network, right? Data, the sensitive data will never be on there, right? And there's controls you can put in place to help identify that and track it and make sure it doesn't happen. So making it available is great. Now, what's the friction point? Well, there needs to be some kind of agreement as to why you're doing this. Are you going for a certification? Are you just educating yourself so that you can do something with it? Well, what is that? So there's some kind of, you have to have a mentor during this process, right? And once you've certified and once you've achieved your goal, maybe you get to keep it and keep going with it, and with some financial caps on each of the accounts so they can't spin up a bunch of stuff and do Bitcoin mining. And you have ways to track that, especially if it's part of your AWS organization. So that's a big key to this, to make it very visible, right? You're tracking your certifications. Have your leaders get certified, right? I was a director. I got all 5 certifications. That was a signal to the rest of the organization. This is really, really important. And it is something to be celebrated that your technical leaders have these certifications and can talk about this. And it created this amazing culture within the Cloud COE in which they could talk to me about challenges that they were facing technically, and I could help out, right? So that was not my primary role, but it was definitely a big part of it. My primary role was, helping lead these people and helping define goals, et cetera, as a director. So the last piece of this equation, this last consideration, is, can I lower cost? Now, the big answer here is yes. Now, the thing that's the trap that a lot of IT folks fall into is, well, this is the cost of VMware plus my servers, and then I divide that by the number of VMs I can run on that set of servers, and that's my cost. So my cost per server is $1,200. That's not it. That's not it at all. What's the cost of your data center? What's the cost of all the people that support that? What's the cost of the lease of your data center? What's the cost of the network? I don't care if it's shared or not. It needs to go into this equation because that is the total cost of ownership of running this. And the experiment to run is, what if you didn't have that? What would it look like? What if you didn't have a data center? Well, then I wouldn't have personnel that I needed to, to staff that data center. I don't have heating. I don't have cooling. I don't have, power. I don't have any of those costs. And that is your total cost. And I can tell you that the analysis I did, there was a cost savings around of $125 million over the course of 5 to 6 years. And then that stayed pretty static. And that was with the cost of actually deploying everything in the cloud. So it was a substantial savings. And let's say it's 10 years, $125 million over 10 years. That's $10 million a year, right? So there is huge cost savings there. And the trap to be aware of is, when you go do your TCO, everybody's going to be like, well, okay, here's the cost of licensing, here's the cost of the hardware, and here's the cost of the people, and that's it. I'm going to divide that by the number of instances. Don't do that. You need to add everything else around it and think about it holistically, right? Power, heating, cooling, facilities. When's your next lease due? Because guess what? There's a big incentive for people, those that offer your lease for your building, unless you own your building, and that's a different story. But if you're doing a lease with somebody and it's about to come up, they'll come in about a year ahead of time and they'll look around and they're like, yeah, we can double it and we can triple it. And that happens all the time because you're locked in. You have no choice. You can threaten them all you want, but there's no way you can move out of a data center if you're really using it in 6 months. No way. So thinking through that scenario is the number one thing when you think about the cost or the total cost of ownership. So what are some ways you can lower the cost? Well, here's a handful of them, right? Get your lower environments to the cloud. Move them up there very quickly. Lower environments tend to be ephemeral. Okay, what I mean by that is you stand them up, you do your thing, and then you can shut them off. Right? And they tend to be things you run during working hours, right? You can shut them off overnight. So you can use, you can do things like shut them down after 5 and turn them on at 7 in the morning, turn them off on the weekends. There's lots of controls, and you can set that up and have a standard set of rules that your team runs. And then you can override them, right? You can say, we've got a big project. We need these up 7x24 for the next 3 weeks. You can put those rules into the system and it keeps the systems running during that time. Right size using auto scaling, right? It is always the exercise of capacity planning. What is the biggest peak? And we need to build to the biggest peak. And that happens and you end up over investing. I did this, I built systems and I'm like, I need 100 gig on this file storage. Oh, I need 100 terabytes or whatever, right? I need some ridiculous amount of storage because I project and I say, well, if this thing takes off, it's, the storage is going to go way up. And oh man, to add storage is a 6-month investment and I have to spin up a project and I have to fight for resources to add it. And I have to do a whole bunch of other things, or it has to be an emergency. And that just disrupts everybody. Well, what if I could expand my storage as I need it, right? Well, guess what the cloud does? All right. Hey, I'm going to start with a small instance because it's only going to be 10 people on it. I'm not going to build a huge cluster with all these resources in it for 10 people. I'm going to build something that's minimum viable for those 10 people. And if it gets bigger, I can add more and more storage. I can go from a small instance to a big instance very quickly. I don't have any of that overhead that's required on-prem. All right. And something that's not on here, but something to think about is your lifecycle program. So today, if you're doing a lifecycle program or an evergreen program, you're going in and taking systems out of your data center that are 3, 5, 10 years old, you're shutting them down and you're putting in new ones and you're migrating those systems over. Well, guess what? That's not necessary in the cloud, right? The moving from one instance to another is done with code. It's no longer a consideration. It's huge. Next is, auto scaling. So there's bursts, right? So if you build for peak, you've over-invested. Well, let's say this is a seasonal thing. So it happens once a quarter or once a month, at the end of the month, mid-month, whatever. You don't build for the peak, you build for the normal, and then you build in rules that when it peaks, you scale up automatically, and then as traffic dies down, it comes back down. Okay, huge cost savings there. All right, your big provisioning, your big systems, your SAPs, right? There's a lot that goes into that, and I know we ended up building a huge cluster of systems that was just this massive amount of work to run, and it cost a lot, and it had its own life cycle, and it was, it was tens of millions of dollars to manage this thing. Well, use the cloud, right? Create the environment on demand for as long as you need it, and then shut it down. And you make it easy for people to see that when you shut it down, you can save everything off and you can recreate that environment from scratch without any, it's all automated and the data's there and the access rules are there and the scaling's there and all the software's there, right? That is a beautiful thing and it saves a lot of money, especially with, like SAP comes out with, monthly or quarterly big releases or whatever, and you want to test them and you want to get them in place. This is a great way to do that. And then lastly, your DR or your failover environments. Okay. Today, you have to build 2 of everything. And often the second thing is the dev environment or your lower environment. It mimics that. And so that's one way to do some cost optimization on-prem. What if you didn't have to do that, right? Yeah, you take your data on-prem and you stream it up to the cloud and it's sitting there waiting to go if there's a big incident. On-prem, you just spin this up in the cloud and you're ready to go. And you only run that for a little bit and then you spin back down to on-prem until you migrate everything up into the cloud. Huge cost savings there because now you're not having to build 2 of everything. You can start to optimize your one data center and shut it down and exit it, right? So you get lots of cool things. That's the first, kind of domino in the chain, if you will. So that's a handful of concerns that I see and that have been based on utilities, what utilities think about, and hopefully this has been useful. Thank you.